Millions of people across the country marching as we speak against the policies of President Trump.
Well, let the world hear you, no kings!
I think what we're seeing is a failure of the United States Constitution. Americans make a huge song and dance about the fact that they don't swear allegiance to a president. They certainly don't swear allegiance to a king. They swear allegiance to a constitution.
What if the system is designed to give you a king you can't remove? Steve Keen, one of the few who predicted the 2008 crash, explains how modern democracies may not be as democratic as they seem.
Rather than a king, they've got a president, and rather than a parliament, they've got a Congress. And now you've got the worst possible outcome. You've elected a mad king. Before anybody says, well, he can't be a tyrant because he's been elected, Hitler was elected, okay?
Your great-grandchildren will still be here when that orange clown is in the dustbin of history.
And so what the Constitution in the minds of Americans is a statement of democratic principles, and they imagine that their overall political system conforms to the Constitution. Now, I think what we're seeing at the moment has always been a myth, because what they have in terms of political system of America versus what the Constitution has to say, there's an enormous gap between the two. Of course, the laws that control the electoral process in America have got constitutional foundations to them. But fundamentally, the American Constitution, drafted at a time then the system that applied in England, which was the dominant power, of course, at the time. That's what the War of Independence was fought to get away from the British. What then happened when the Americans who won that war, of course, this is the 250th anniversary of that victory in that revolt against the autocratic rule they faced from the King of England. 1/4 of a millennium has passed since the War of Independence, and there, of course, the writing and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But it's not amazing that what the drafters of the Constitution did was reproduce the British system. The British system at the time had a very powerful monarch, partially limited by a parliament. There had been civil wars in England before that ended up limiting an absolute monarchy to a monarchy that had to largely get the agreement of the parliament. That's exactly the system the Americans established. Rather than a king, they've got a president, and rather than a parliament, they've got a Congress. But it's still basically the same idea. The Congress is elected separately to the king. That's different to the British system these days because, of course, the significance of the monarch has been dropped dramatically in the UK over time. So 250 years ago, yes, the king had immense power, and the king could decide to start wars, and the king could be involved in treaties and so on. All that's been whittled back since the American Constitution was written, so that now the English king is basically a symbolic role, and all the power resides in the parliament. When you vote in the English system, you never vote for the king because the king is hereditary. So the king is just, whoever pops out of the womb is the next king. But in the electoral system, you elect the prime minister, and you elect the prime minister not directly. You elect the parties that fight for the major number of seats in the House of Parliament, and then they have nominated one of their own members to be the Prime Minister. And of course, we've seen rather embarrassingly in the English case over the last 15 years that the Prime Minister can be deposed, but the party that he represents still remains in power. The Prime Minister in the UK is very different now to the President in America. Now, in America, when you hold an election, you elect the President separately from the members of Congress, and the President cannot be removed by Congress, whereas in the British system as it applies now, the Prime Minister can be removed by the Parliament.
Well, if that's whetted your appetite to have a realistic approach to economics, then join me and learn realistic economics through stevekeen.com. You can use my Ravel software, that you can talk to me and ask me questions. It's a free book bundle that's available just this week. To apply, go to stevekeen.com or scan the QR code.
The American system was set up to emulate the constrained monarchy that England had in the 1780s, and basically it's frozen in time. That hasn't changed. Whereas the British system has changed. Back then they had a very powerful monarch who was limited by Parliament, but Parliament itself was completely elected, and you had the leader of the major parliamentary party became the Prime Minister. So the laws were drafted by the Parliament and that have to be approved by the King, but the King could not control the Parliament. That evolution actually was frozen out by the Americans locking it into their constitution at the time they got their independence from the British. So what you have now is a American system, which is like the British system 250 years earlier, of a king who, if he wants to, can drastically exceed his own powers. Constitution has various provisions to try to handle the situation where you get a mad president being in control. But the irony in that system is that the people who are given the power under, I think it's Section 25 of the American Constitution, to remove the president if he appears to be incapable of carrying out his duties properly, the people who are given the power to do that are people who were being appointed by the president in the first instance. So the person who's got the most power, in some sense, to depose President Trump is Vice President Vance, who was appointed by President Trump. It's ridiculous. It's a bit like if you imagine taking it back to an analogy that the American system was based on, which is the British system in the 1700s. It's a bit as if you've given the power to depose the king to the person the king appointed to take care of his horses. He's not going to do it. It's quite possible the son of the king might have deposed the king. That happened regularly in the feudal days. But somebody the king himself appointed, being told you can depose the king, he would have been dead before he took a step in the 1700s. And again, the whole possibility that Vance will declare that Trump is incapable of carrying out the office and depose him according to Section 25 of the Constitution, with all the other controls that are in the world, it's a joke. It's not going to happen. So the American Constitution isn't something that you should praise, it's something you should vilify. It's locked you into a failed system, and now you've got the worst possible outcome. You've elected a mad king. Now, before anybody says, "Oh, he can't be a tyrant because he's been elected," Hitler was elected, okay? Once you get the position of power, does the system give you the chance to remove him? And in the American system, it's written in Section 25 that there's a way to do it, but the chances of that happening are virtually zero. So you're stuck with a king you can't get rid of. And that points out that your constitution, which you venerate, you should instead really vilify and say, we got it wrong 250 years ago, we have to redesign it so it's actually democratic. And there's so many things about the American system that Americans seem to take for granted as the definition of democracy, and all these structures they have are, they think they're the bastion of democracy. In fact, it's almost the most undemocratic electoral system you can possibly imagine. For a start, to actually get on the ballots to be able to stand for election in America, it's controlled by the states, generally speaking. And the states themselves will only let Republicans or Democrats stand. It's extremely hard to get somebody else on the ballot. Now, contrast that to the English system, almost a caricature of the opposite of that situation. Anybody can stand for election in any of the electorates in the UK system. So there's one guy who's stood quite regularly to try to embarrass the leaders, and he calls himself Count Binface. He gives talks inside a garbage bin, and from that point he makes his pronunciations. He stood in every election. If you've ever watched Monty Python, there's a Monty Python skit to send up the English electoral system, and they have the silly party versus the sensible party, and some of the silly party members are people like the simplest one is a guy called Kevin Phillips Bong, but they have others ones called Tarquin Tin Tin Lin Bin Ole Ole Biscuit Barrel, and the name goes on for 200 or 300 syllables after that, and basically it says anybody can stand in the British system. So for starters, you're limited to Republicans or Democrats. I'm going to make a prediction, and I'm 100% confident I'm going to be right. The next president of America will be either a Republican or a Democrat. Okay? Now, in the British case, you may have said that same thing, that you're either going to get a Tory or a Labour Party person before the last election. But what's happened in the British electoral system is the public is so disgusted with the current Labour Party that it looks like the Labour Party on current polls in the UK will get no more than 3 seats out of 600 in the next parliament, and the Tories will get 0. And what you're going to get is quite probably either Reform, which is Nigel Farage, who's a bit like a Trump with an English accent, or you might get Zach Polanski, who's an extremely progressive Green Party member. And so you get a complete electoral shift in the UK. Quite likely the government and opposition parties from the next British Parliament will have been neither Tory nor Labour. They will be Green versus Reform, whichever one wins, we can't say at the moment, but it's almost certainly not going to be the two parties in power. The American system, you're going to be a Republican or a Democrat. That locks you out for alternatives. And if you look around the world, you can see far better examples of how you can make your electoral selections. So most other countries have the system that the British have got at the moment, which is where you vote for a parliament and you vote for parties in the parliament, and the dominant party selects the leader who becomes the prime minister. That's certainly better than what you've got, but it's by far from being the best possible system. So I hope what you learn from this No Kings demonstration is it isn't just a case of getting rid of the king. You need to get rid of a constitution that makes you select a king in the first instance.